The Chains of Sorrow. In the Mississippi Delta of 1832, where the river wound like a serpent through fields of cotton and sorrow, the air was thick with the weight of loss and the hum of cicadas. He was a man of 30, his skin dark as the midnight river, his eyes deep with a silence that spoke louder than words. Taken from a Yoruba village, he had been mute since the Middle Passage, his voice stolen by the horrors of the sea, his body scarred by the lash of Silas's cruelty. And lament, its banks fringed with cotton fields that bore the weight of countless sorrows. Blackthorn Manor stood as a monument to greed, its whitewashed walls gleaming under a relentless sun, its slave cabins a stark reminder of the chains that bound its people.
Esther
moved through the manor's kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared meals for the Beaumont family, her thoughts tethered to her daughter Lila, whose fever clung like a curse. The baby's breaths were shallow, her small body frail in the cradle Esther had placed near the hearth, hoping the warmth might drive out the sickness. Clara Beaumont's cold eyes watched her every move, her voice sharp with demands, while Silas, the master, prowled the fields, his whip a constant threat. Esther's grief was a heavy cloak, her husband's death a wound that bled anew with each of Lila's weakening cries, yet the memory of the previous night's melodic whim's voice, rising from the cellar like a river through the darkness had, kindled a fragile hope in her heart, and the song a Yoruba lament had calmed Lila's fever, if only for a moment. And Esther clung to that spark, a mystery that defied the despair of Blackthorn Manor. Kwame was a shadow, his presence barely noted save for the labor he endured, his hands hauling cotton bales, his silence a shield against the world's brutality. His broad frame, scarred by years of toil and torment, moved through the plantation like a shadow, his eyes deep with a quiet strength that Esther had barely noticed until his song pierced the night. She had seen him in the fields, his hands hauling cotton under Silas's lash, his head bowed, his voice absent. But now, knowing he could sing, Esther felt a pull toward him, a need to understand the power in his voice to save her daughter from the fever's grip. The day was a haze of labor, Esther's hands chopping vegetables, her ears straining for any sound from the cellar. But Kwame was silent, his chains a mournful clink as he was led to the fields. The other slaves whispered of him, their voices low, their eyes wary. "He don't speak," said Jonah, an older man whose back bore the scars of defiance. Never has, not since they brought him here. If he's singing now, it's a sign good or ill, I can't say. Esther's heart quickened, her thoughts a tangle of hope and fear. Lila's life hung by a thread, and Kwame's song was a lifeline she could not ignore. Esther had seen him, his head bowed, his chains clinking as he was led to the fields. But she had never heard him speak, never seen him as more than a ghost in the manor's margins. One night, as Lila's fever burned hotter and the doctor's tonics failed, Esther sat by her daughter's cradle, her prayers a desperate whisper under the moon's indifferent gaze. The plantation was silent, save for the creak of the wind and the distant cry of an owl. Down. From the cellar below, a sound rose, a low, haunting melody, a voice like a river flowing through the darkness. It was Kwame, singing for the first time in years, his song, a Yoruba lament, rich with the cadence of a lost home. Esther froze, her heart stirring, and to her astonishment, Lila's breathing eased, her tiny hand twitching, as if reaching for the music. The song was a spark, a mystery, a hope, and Esther, a mother drowning in grief, felt a thread of light pierce her despair. But in Blackthorn Manor, where every gift came with a price, Kwame's voice was a dangerous flame. And Esther stood at the edge of a discovery that could heal her child or chain them both to a fate unknown. The plantation of Blackthorn Manor sprawled under a sky heavy with heat, its whitewashed mansion a cruel contrast to the ramshackle slave cabins huddled in its shadow. Esther, a young mother of 25, moved through the world like a ghost, her heart a hollow vessel since the fever had claimed her husband and now threatened her infant daughter. Lila, her once bright eyes were dulled by grief, her hands trembling as she tended to Lila's frail form, the baby's breaths shallow, her skin hot to the touch. The plantation's mistress, Clara Beaumont, offered no mercy, her cold gaze fixed on profit, her husband Silas, a man whose whip was as sharp as his greed. Esther, a freeborn woman from a nearby settlement, had come to Blackthorn seeking work after her husband's death, only to find herself bound by debt and desperation, her life tethered to the manor's endless demands. In the cellar of the mansion, where the air was damp and the walls wept with mold, a slave named Kwame was chained. His song in the shadows. The Mississippi Delta, in the sweltering summer of 1832, was a land where the river's murmur carried both life. Kwame, the mute slave chained in the cellar, was a figure of enigma. His silence a fortress built from the horrors of his past. As dusk fell, painting the delta in shades of amber and ash, Esther slipped from the kitchen, her heart pounding as she carried a bowl of thin stew to the cellar. The manor was quiet, Clara and Silas dining in the grand hall, their laughter a cruel contrast to the sorrow that clung to the walls. "What's this?" he growled, his voice a blade that cut through the melody. Esther returned to Lila, whose fever had eased slightly, her breath steadier, as if Kwame's song lingered in her small body. But the manor was a crucible, its walls closing in, and Silas's threat was a chain that bound them both. Blackthorn Manor stood as a fortress of cruelty, its whitewashed walls gleaming with a false promise of grace, its slave cabins sagging under the weight of despair. Esther saw him from the kitchen window, his broad frame bent under the sun, his eyes deep with a quiet strength that seemed to defy the lash. The other slaves spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices laced with awe and fear. "That song wasn't natural," Jonah whispered as he passed Esther with a load of firewood. "It's got power, but power draws eyes. Silas won't let it lie." Esther's heart quickened, her thoughts a tangle of hope and dread. She had begged Kwame to sing, to save her daughter, but Silas's words, "Power's dangerous," code like a warning drum. The plantation was a crucible, its air thick with the scent of cotton and cruelty, and Esther knew that Kwame's voice was a spark that could ignite salvation or ruin. Clara Beaumont watched her closely, her cold eyes narrowing with suspicion, her voice sharp as she issued orders. "Mind your work, Esther," she snapped. "Your child's no excuse for slacking," Esther nodded, her head bowed but her heart burned with a defiance she could not voice. A resolve to protect Lila and uncover the mystery of Kwame's song. Esther moved through the kitchen, her hands trembling as she kneaded dough, her heart tethered to her daughter Lila, whose fever clung like a shadow, despite the fleeting relief of Kwame's song. The manor was quiet. Silas and Clara retired to their chambers, their wealth a shield against the sorrow that clung to the walls. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with the tears of the earth. Kwame sat against the stone, his wrists bound by iron, his eyes lifting to meet hers, deep and unreadable. "I heard you again last night," Esther whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt before him. "Your song, it's helping, Lila. She's stronger. Please, tell me what it is, why it works." Kwame's gaze held hers, a flicker of pain crossing his face, and for a moment she thought he would remain silent. But then he spoke, his voice a low rumble, like the river's flow. The first words she had ever heard him utter. "For my people, for healing, for spirits to guide the sick. I sang it for my son once, before they took him." His voice broke, a wound laid bare, and Esther's heart ached, seeing in his eyes the mirror of her own grief. The baby's breaths were steadier now, her small body less frail, but the spark of hope was fragile. Threatened by Silas Beaumont's wrath and the chains that bound Kwame in the cellar, Esther's grief was a heavy tide, pulling her under, but the memory of Kwame's voice, a Yoruba melody, rich and haunting, had lit a fire in her soul, a belief that his song held a power beyond her understanding. Yet in Blackthorn Manor, every gift came with a price, and Esther felt the weight of Silas's threat, his suspicion of Kwame's voice, a blade poised to cut them all. Esther sat by the cradle, her hands trembling, her heart a forge where fear and hope were hammered into resolve. Kwame's voice was a mystery, a gift with a price she could not yet fathom. But it was also a spark that could save her daughter or doom them all. The plantation was a powder keg, and Esther, a grieving mother, stood at its heart. Her soul tethered to a mute slave whose song could heal, and a child whose life hung by a thread. The stars above Blackthorn Manor blinked, indifferent to her plight, and Esther whispered a prayer, her voice a quiet rebellion, knowing that the path ahead would demand a courage she had never known. "You woman, consorting with a slave? And you mute, daring to sing? Esther froze, her heart a drumbeat of fear, but Kwame's silence returned, his eyes lowering, his song a fading echo. You'll pay for this, he said, his gaze flicking between them. Both of you. Esther's breath caught, her thoughts racing to Lila, to the fragile hope Kwame's voice had kindled. She stood, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. He did nothing, sir, she said. I asked him to sing, for my daughter. She's dying. Silas's lips curled, but his eyes lingered on Kwame, a suspicion taking root. A slave with a voice like that, he muttered. There's power in it, and power's dangerous. Turned to Esther, his voice cold. Get back to your work. The mute stays chained. One more sound, and he'll taste the lash. Esther nodded, her head bowed, but her heart burned with a defiance she could not voice. As she climbed the cellar stairs, Kwame's eyes followed her, a silent promise that his song was not yet done. The cellar door creaked as Esther descended, the air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. Kwame sat against the stone, his wrists bound by iron, his eyes lifting to meet hers, deep and unreadable. I heard you, Esther whispered, her voice trembling as she set the bowl before him. Last night, your song. It helped my Lila. She's sick. Dying. Sing again. Kwame's gaze held hers, a flicker of something pain, perhaps, or a memory crossing his face. He shook his head, his silence a wall, but Esther knelt closer, her desperation a spark in the dark. She's all I have, she said, tears brimming. Your voice did something. I don't know how, but it did. The cellar was a tomb, its silence oppressive, but Kwame's eyes softened, and he opened his mouth, a low hum rising. A melody like the river's flow, rich with the cadence of a Yoruba prayer. The sound was a balm, a light in the darkness, and Esther felt a shiver, as if the song reached beyond the cellar, to Lila's cradle, to the heart of her fading child. But the song was cut short by a shadow at the cellar door. Silas Beaumont, his face a mask of fury, his whip coiled in his hand. The night was heavy, the delta alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of the river, the melody of defiance. The Mississippi Delta, in the oppressive heat of 1832, was a land where the river's song was drowned by the cries of the enslaved. Its cotton fields a canvas of suffering under a sky that burned without mercy. Kwame remained in the cellar, his silence restored, his chains a mournful clink as he was led to the fields each dawn. As dusk painted the delta in shades of violet and ash, Esther slipped to the cellar once more, her heart pounding as she carried a scrap of bread and a plea. The cellar seemed to tighten around them, the air charged with the weight of his words. Esther's breath caught, her thoughts racing to Lila, to the hope that Kwame's song could save her. Will you sing again? She asked, her voice a plea. For her? Kwame's eyes darkened, a shadow of fear crossing his face. Its cotton fields stretching like a shroud under a sky heavy with heat and unspoken rebellion. Blackthorn Manor stood as a citadel of cruelty, its whitewashed facade a cruel mockery of the suffering within its walls. The manor was quiet, Silas and Clara dining in the grand hall, their laughter a cruel echo against the sorrow that clung to the walls. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. Esther sobbed, clutching her daughter, the miracle of fire that warmed her soul. But the cellar's silence was a weight, and she knew Kwame had paid a price for his song. She returned to find him slumped against the wall, his back bloodied, his eyes closed, his breath shallow but steady. Silas was gone, his whip a discarded threat, his suspicion a storm that had not yet broken. Esther knelt beside Kwame, her hands trembling as she pressed the cornbread to his lips. You saved her, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." Kwame's eyes opened, a faint smile curving his lips, and he nodded, his silence returning, but his strength unbroken. The plantation was a powder keg, its walls closing in, and Esther knew that Kwame's voice was a gift that could heal, but also a chain that bound them to danger. The delta was alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of the river. And Esther's heart was a forge, hammering fear into courage, her soul tethered to a mute slave whose song had sparked a miracle, and a child whose life was a flame that would not die. Kwame sat against the stone, his wrists bound by iron, his eyes lifting to meet hers, deep with a quiet strength that seemed to defy his chains. "Lila's better," Esther whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt before him. "Your song, it's working, but Silas knows. He'll hurt you if you sing again." Kwame's gaze held hers, a flicker of fear crossing his face, but also a resolve that mirrored her own. "I sang for my son," he said, his voice a low rumble, thick with his Yoruba accent. "I'll sing for your Lila, but each song takes a piece of me. It's a prayer, Esther, and prayers have a price." His words were a blade, cutting through her hope, and she felt the weight of his sacrifice, the pain he bore to give her daughter a chance. Esther moved through the kitchen, her hands trembling as she scrubbed pots, her heart tethered to her daughter Lila, whose fever had eased you again, he growled, his voice a thunderclap in the damp air. "And you mute, singing your devil's songs?" Esther froze, her heart a drumbeat of terror. But Kwame's voice rose, unyielding, a Yoruba prayer that filled the cellar with a power that seemed to shake the walls. Silas's whip lashed out, striking Kwame's back, a red line blooming across his skin. But the song did not falter, its melody a river that flowed through the pain. Esther's breath caught, her eyes filling with tears as she felt the song reach beyond the cellar, to Lila's cradle, to the heart of her dying child. Silas roared, his whip striking again, but Kwame's voice held, a defiance that burned brighter than the lash. "Stop!" Esther cried, throwing herself between them, her voice a spark in the dark. "He's saving her. My daughter's alive because of him." Silas's eyes narrowed, his whip poised. But a new sound broke the tension, a child's cry, strong and clear. From the kitchen above, "Lila." Esther's heart lurched, and she ran, leaving Kwame to Silas's wrath, her feet pounding the stairs as she raced to her daughter. But not broken, her small body still fragile in the cradle by the hearth. The memory of Kwame's song, a Yoruba prayer, rich and haunting, burned in Esther's soul, a spark of hope that had steadied Lila's breaths, but also drawn the wrath of Silas Beaumont. The plantation master's suspicion was a blade sharp and unyielding, and Esther felt its edge as she worked her eyes darting to the window, where Kwame toiled in the fields, his chains a mournful clink under the overseer's watchful gaze. Clara Beaumont's cold eyes followed her, her voice sharp with commands. But Esther's thoughts were with the mute slave whose voice had kindled a miracle. And with the price that miracle might demand, "It draws attention," he said. "Silas knows. He'll break me if I sing again." Esther had seen the pain in his eyes, the grief for a son lost to the sea, and she knew his voice was a wound as much as a gift. The other slaves whispered of him, their voices laced with fear and awe. "His song's got power," Jonah murmured, as he passed with a load of cotton, his eyes wary. "But Silas'll break him for it. You too, Esther, if you ain't careful." Her heart quickened, the weight of his warning a chain around her hope. Lila's life hung by a thread, and Kwame's song was a lifeline. But the plantation was a crucible, its air thick with the scent of sweat and fear. Clara's scrutiny was relentless, her suspicion growing with each glance at Esther's distracted hands. "Your work's slipping," she snapped, her voice a lash. "Mind your place, or you'll find yourself in the fields with the rest." Esther nodded, her head bowed, but her heart burned with a defiance she could not voice, a resolve to save her daughter, no matter the cost. Esther's desperation was a fire, burning through her fear. "He'll break us both if Lila dies," she said, tears brimming. "Please." His silence was a wall, but his eyes softened and he nodded, a reluctant vow. The melody rose again, a Yoruba prayer, its cadence a river that flowed through the darkness. Rich with the sorrow and strength of a lost home, Esther closed her eyes, letting the song wash over her, imagining it reaching Lila's cradle, soothing her fever, mending her fragile life. But the song was cut short by a shadow at the cellar door. Jana, his face pale with urgency. "Silas is coming," he hissed. He heard the singing. "Go, Esther, now." Her heart lurched, and she scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she fled the cellar. Kwame's song a fading echo behind her. The night was alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant roll of thunder, a storm gathering on the horizon. Esther returned to Lila, whose fever had eased further, her small chest rising with steadier breaths, as if Kwame's song lingered in her bones. But the manor was a powder keg, Silas's suspicion a match ready to strike. Esther sat by the cradle, her heart a forge where fear and hope were hammered into resolve. Kwame's voice was a gift, a mystery, a power that could heal her daughter, but it was also a chain that bound them to danger. The plantation was a crucible, its walls closing in, and Esther knew that Silas's wrath was a storm that would not wait. She whispered a prayer, her voice a quiet rebellion. Her thoughts tethered to the mute slave whose song had sparked a hope she could not let die. The stars above Blackthorn Manor blinked their light a faint promise, and Esther braced herself, knowing that the path to Lila, salvation would demand a courage forged in the fire of Kwame's voice, a price she was ready to pay. The price of a song, the Mississippi Delta, in the stifling dawn of 1832, was a land where the river's whispers were drowned by the weight of oppression. Kwame was a shadow in the fields, his broad frame bent under the sun, his silence restored after the cellar's fleeting song. As dusk fell, painting the delta in shades of crimson and ash, Esther slipped to the cellar once more, her heart pounding as she carried a scrap of cornbread in a desperate plea. Before Esther could speak, a shadow fell across the cellar door. Silas, his face a mask of fury, his whip coiled in his hand. Lila was in her cradle, her eyes bright, her fever broken, her small hands reaching for Esther as if guided by the song still echoing in the air. The echo of sacrifice. The Mississippi Delta and the searing light of 1832 was a land where the river's gentle flow masked the brutality of its shores. The cotton fields of Blackthorn Manor stretching like a wound under a sky that burned without mercy. The plantation stood as a fortress of oppression, its whitewashed walls a facade of order, its slave cabins sagging under the weight of despair. The manor was quiet, Silas and Clara in their chambers, their wealth a shield against the sorrow that clung to the walls. Esther's hands trembled as she bound his wounds, her heart a forge where fear and courage were hammered into resolve. Esther found Lila in her cradle, her small face peaceful, her breath steady, as if Kwame's song lingered in her bones. But the manor was a powder keg, Silas's suspicion a match ready to strike. Esther sat by the cradle, her heart racing as she heard Silas's boots on the stairs, his voice a low growl as he spoke to Clara. "That slave song is no natural thing," he said, his words carrying through the walls. "It's a danger, and I'll root it out." Esther's breath caught, her thoughts a tangle of fear and defiance. Though Kwame's voice was a miracle, a gift that had saved her daughter, but it was also a chain that bound them to Silas's wrath. She whispered a prayer, her voice a quiet rebellion, her soul tethered to the mute slave whose song had sparked a hope she could not let die. The stars above Blackthorn Manor blinked their light, a faint promise, and Esther braced herself, knowing that the path to Lila, salvation, would demand a courage forged in the fire of Kwame's sacrifice, a price that could cost them everything. "Why does it work?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Ash, your song, what is it?" Kwame's eyes darkened, a shadow of memory crossing his face. The plantation stood as a citadel of cruelty, its whitewashed walls gleaming with a false promise of order, its slave cabins sagging under the burden of despair. Esther sat by Lila's cradle in the kitchen, her heart a fragile vessel torn between relief and dread. Her daughter's fever had retreated, her small breath steady, her eyes bright with a life reclaimed from the edge of death. Kwame's song a Yoruba prayer, rich and haunting, had woven a miracle, its melody a thread that had pulled Lila back from the abyss. But the cost was etched in the blood on Kwame's back. The lash marks from Silas Beaumont's whip a stark reminder of the price of his defiance. Esther's hands trembled as she rocked the cradle, her thoughts tethered to the mute slave in the cellar, whose voice had saved her child but drawn the master's wrath. The manor was a powder keg, Silas's accusation of witchcraft a spark that threatened to ignite it all. and Esther felt the weight of a storm gathering, its shadow cast by the power in Kwame's song. "It's a gift from my people," he said. "A prayer to the Orishas, to guide the sick, to call their spirits home. But it takes strength, Esther. Each note is a piece of me, and Silas knows it." His words were a blade, cutting through her hope. And she realized the price of his song was not just the lash, but something deeper, a toll on his soul. Before she could speak, a shadow fell across the cellar door Jonah, his face pale with urgency. "Silas is coming," he hissed. "He's heard talk of the song of Lila's recovery. He's calling it witchcraft." Esther's heart lurched, and she stood, her hands shaking as she pressed the cloth into Kwame's hand. "I'll come back," she whispered, a vow she meant to keep, and fled the cellar. Her feet pounding the stairs as she raced to Lila. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. Kwame sat against the stone, his wrists bound by iron, his back a canvas of blood and scars. His eyes lifted to meet hers, deep with pain, but alight with a strength that seemed to defy his chains. "I'm sorry," Esther whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him, gently pressing the cloth to his wounds. "Your song saved her, but it cost you this." Kwame's gaze held hers, and he spoke, his voice a low rumble, thick with his Yoruba accent. "I sang for my son long ago," he said. "I sing for your Lila now. The pain is nothing if it brings life." His words were a spark, igniting Esther's gratitude and guilt. And she felt the weight of his sacrifice, a debt she could never repay. Esther sat by Lila's cradle in the kitchen, her heart a fragile vessel overflowing with relief and dread. Her daughter's fever had broken, her small breath steady, her eyes bright with a life that had teetered on the edge of death. Kwame's song, Yoruba, prayer, rich and haunting, had worked a miracle, its melody a thread that had pulled Lila back from the abyss. But the cost was etched in the blood on Kwame's back. The lash marks from Silas Beaumont's whip a testament to the price of his defiance. Esther's hands trembled as she rocked the cradle, her thoughts tethered to the mute slave in the cellar, whose voice had saved her child but bound them both to a dangerous path. The manor was a crucible, its air thick with the scent of cotton and cruelty. Kina, and Esther felt the weight of Silas's suspicion, a storm gathering on the horizon. Kwame remained chained in the cellar, his silence restored. His broad frame slumped against the damp stone, his scars a map of sacrifice. Esther had seen him at dawn, led to the fields under the overseer's watchful eye. His steps heavy, but his eyes unyielding, a quiet strength that defied the lash. The other slaves whispered of him, their voices a mix of awe and fear. "His song's a spirit's call," Jonah murmured as he passed Esther with a basket of cotton, his eyes wary. "But Silas won't abide it. He'll break Kwame and you with him, if you keep this up." Esther's heart quickened, the warning a chain around her hope. Lila's recovery was a miracle, but Kwame's voice was a flame that drew eyes. And Silas's wrath was a blade poised to strike. Clara Beaumont's scrutiny was relentless, her cold eyes narrowing as she watched Esther's every move. "Your child's better," she said, her voice sharp as she inspected the kitchen. "Don't think it gives you leave to idle." Esther nodded, her head bowed, but her heart burned with a defiance she could not voice. A resolve to protect Lila and repay Kwame for the gift of his song. As dusk fell, painting the delta in shades of amber and shadow, Esther slipped to the cellar, her heart pounding as she carried a scrap of cloth to bind Kwame's wounds and a whispered plea for forgiveness. The cellar seemed to close around them, the air charged with the echo of his song, a prayer that had reached beyond the stone to heal her child. The night was heavy, the delta alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of the river, the flame of rebellion. The Mississippi Delta, in the oppressive dusk of 1832, was a land where the river's gentle murmur was drowned by the weight of suffering, its cotton fields a silent testament to the chains that bound Blackthorn Manor's people. Kwame remained in the cellar, his silence a heavy cloak, its broad frame slumped against the damp stone, his scars a map of sacrifice and survival. Esther had seen him at dawn, led to the fields under the overseer's lash, his steps heavy but his eyes unyielding, a quiet strength that defied the chains. The manor was quiet, Silas and Clara in their chambers, their wealth a shield against the sorrow that clung to the walls. Esther's hands trembled as she bound his wounds, her heart a forge where fear and courage were hammered into resolve. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Silas will kill you if he thinks you're a threat." Blackthorn Manor stood as a fortress of cruelty, its whitewashed walls gleaming with a false promise of order, its slave cabins trembling under the burden of fear. Esther sat by Lila's cradle in the kitchen, her heart a fragile vessel torn between hope and terror. The manor was quiet, Silas and Clara in their chambers, their wealth a shield against the sorrow that clung to the walls. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. Consorting with the devil's servant, singing his spells. Kwame's eyes darkened, a shadow of fear crossing his face. "They'll break me before they listen," he said. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the cellar door. Ezekiel, his gaunt frame looming, his eyes burning with zeal. "Ah! Come see her, preacher. See the truth." The lash marks from Silas Beaumont's whip a testament to the price of his defiance. "I knew it," he hissed, his voice a venomous accusation. Esther stood, her body shielding Kwame, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "It's no spell," she said. Esther's hands trembled as she rocked the cradle, her thoughts tethered to Kwame in the cellar, whose voice had saved her child but drawn the wrath of a master and a zealot. The manor was a powder keg, and Esther stood at its heart, her soul a forge where fear was hammered into courage. Quame's eyes darkened, a shadow of memory crossing his face. A resolve to protect Lila and shield Quame from the storm that loomed. Esther had seen him at dawn, led to the fields under the overseer's lash, his steps heavy, but his eyes unyielding, a quiet strength that defied the chains. The other slaves whispered of him, their voices a mix of awe and dread. Ezekiel's calling for a reckoning, Jonah murmured as he passed Esther with a load of cotton, his eyes darting toward the manor. Says Quame's song is a devil's spell. Her heart quickened, the warning a blade that cut through her hope. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the cellar door, not Silas. Lila's recovery was a gift, but Kwame's voice was a flame that drew danger. I heard the song, Woman, and Ezekiel's zeal was a chain that bound them to a darker fate. But the preacher, Ezekiel, a gaunt man with eyes like burning coals, his voice a hiss of accusation. Witchcraft, he spat, his gaze locking on Kwame. You consort with a devil's servant. Esther's heart lurched. But Silas calls it witchcraft. He'll hurt you again. And she stood, her body shielding Kwame, her voice steady, despite the terror in her chest. He's no devil, she said. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed, his hand clutching a cross, and he turned to leave, his voice a promise of retribution. And the Lord will judge. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. The cellar seemed to tighten around them, the air charged with the echo of his song. A prayer that had saved her child, but kindled a fire of suspicion. Esther led Ezekiel to the kitchen, her heart pounding as she lifted Lila from the cradle, her daughter's small face bright with life. Her breaths, a testament to Kwame's song. The preacher's eyes widened, his cross trembling in his hand, and for a moment Esther saw a flicker of awe. A crack in his zeal. Die. But Silas's voice broke the silence, his boots heavy on the floor as he entered, his whip coiled, his face a mask of fury. "What's this?" he roared, his gaze sweeping from Esther to Ezekiel to Lila. "You defy me with this witchcraft?" Esther's heart pounded, her arms tightening around Lila, whose small hands reached out as if still touched by the melody. "You," he said, his whip pointing at the slave. "Your song, what is it?" Silas's decision hung like a storm cloud, his whip a silent threat, but Lila's recovery was a light that pierced his cruelty. Esther returned to her work, her hands steady, but her thoughts racing. The memory of Kwame's song, a thread that wove hope through her despair. The plantation was a crucible, its walls closing in, and Silas's threat was a chain that bound them both. But Lila's life was a miracle, a light that burned brighter than any whip, and Esther knew she could not stop. She slipped to the cellar one last time, under the cover of night, her heart pounding as she whispered to Kwame through the darkness. "You saved her," she said, tears brimming. "I'll find a way to free you." Kwame's eyes gleamed, a faint smile curving his lips, and he hummed a low note that carried the echo of his prayer, a promise that his song would live. The delta was alive with the hum of cicadas and the murmur of the river, and Esther's heart was a river, flowing with gratitude, with defiance, with a courage forged in the fire of Kwame's sacrifice. The stars above Blackthorn Manor blinked, their light a faint hope, and Esther braced herself, knowing that the path ahead would demand a rebellion that could free them or chain them to a darker fate. "No more singing," he said at last, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. "The mute stays chained, and you, Esther, keep to your work. One more step out of line, and you'll both pay." He turned to Kwame, his eyes narrowing. "Your song saved the child, but it's a chain now. Break it, and you'll break with it." Esther's heart sank, but she nodded, her head bowed, her soul burning with a defiance she could not voice. Kwame's eyes met hers, a silent vow that his song was not done, and she felt a surge of gratitude and fear, knowing his sacrifice had bound their fates. As Silas and Clara left, Ezekiel lingered, his cross still in hand, his eyes softer now. "I'll pray for you," he whispered to Esther, a flicker of humanity in his zeal. And for him, the kitchen was quiet. Lila's breaths a steady rhythm, and Esther knelt beside her daughter, her heart a forge where courage was shaped. Not a word. "Speak, or I'll have the truth whipped out of you." Kwame's eyes met Silas's, unyielding, and he spoke, his voice a low rumble, thick with his Yoruba accent. "It's a prayer to the Orishas to heal, to guide the sick back to life. I sang it for my son, lost to me. I sing it for Lila now." His words were a spark, igniting a flicker of awe in Ezekiel's eyes. But Silas's face darkened, his fear of power. He could not control a storm brewing within. Esther's heart quickened, her voice rising before Silas could act. "He's no threat," she said, stepping forward, Lila in her arms. "He saved her, Silas. You can't punish a man for a miracle." The room stilled, the air charged with the weight of her defiance, and Silas's whip wavered, his resolve shaken by the truth before him. Ezekiel nodded slowly, his voice grudging. "Child lives," he said. "The song is no curse. Let him be." But Clara's eyes gleamed with calculation, her voice cold. "A slave with such power is dangerous," she said. "If he sings, others will listen. The fields will stir." "It's no witchcraft," Esther said, her voice steady despite the storm within, her eyes locked on Silas. "It's a gift, a prayer from his people. It saved my daughter. You saw it?" "Aye." Silas's jaw tightened, his whip twitching. But his gaze faltered, caught by Lila's bright eyes, her recovery a truth he could not deny. Ezekiel stepped forward, his voice a hiss, but softer now, laced with uncertainty. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his cross trembling in his hand. "But this, This song is no work of the devil. I felt it. The admission was a crack in his armor, a spark that shifted the room's balance. Clara Beaumont, silent until now, stood at the edge of the kitchen, her cold eyes narrowing, her voice sharp as she spoke. If it's no witchcraft, then what is it, preacher? And what do we do with a slave who holds such power? The question was a blade, and Esther felt its edge, knowing that Kwame's gift was both their salvation and their danger. Esther's heart lurched, but she stood tall, her voice a spark in the dark. It's no witchcraft, she said, holding Lila close. It's a prayer, and it saved her. Let Kwame sing, Silas. Let him prove it. The room stilled, the air taut with the weight of her defiance, and Ezekiel's doubt grew. His eyes flickering between Lila and Silas. Kwame was brought from the cellar, his chains clinking, his eyes unyielding, and he sang. His voice a river that filled the kitchen, a Yoruba prayer that seemed to shake the walls. Lila stirred, her small hands reaching out, and Silas's face paled, his whip wavering, a crack in his cruelty. The plantation was a powder keg, and Esther's courage was a flame. Her soul tethered to the mute slave whose song had sparked a miracle, and a child whose life was a light she would not let die. The crucible of faith, the Mississippi Delta, in the heavy night of 1832, was a land where the river's soft lament was drowned by the weight of suffering, its cotton fields a silent shroud under a sky pierced by stars. Blackthorn Manor stood as a fortress of cruelty, its whitewashed walls a facade of order, its slave cabins trembling under the burden of fear. Esther stood in the kitchen, her heart a forge where hope and terror clashed. Her daughter Lila cradled in her arms, the child's steady breaths a testament to the miracle of Kwame's song. The Yoruba prayer, rich and haunting, had filled the room moments ago, its melody a river that seemed to shake the very walls. Silencing Silas Beaumont's fury and cracking the preacher Ezekiel's zealous resolve, Kwame stood before them, his wrists bound by iron, his back scarred by the lash, his eyes unyielding with a quiet strength that defied his chains. Esther's defiance, her demand that Silas hear the song, see the truth, had lit a spark in the powder keg of the plantation. And the air was taut with the weight of what might come. Silas's whip hung limp in his hand, his face pale, his eyes flickering between Lila's bright gaze and Kwame's unbowed stance. Ezekiel clutched his cross, his fervor wavering, a shadow of doubt creeping into his burning eyes. The manor was a crucible, and Esther stood at its heart, her soul tethered to a mute slave whose voice had saved her child, and a child whose life was a flame that could not be extinguished. The silence in the kitchen was a living thing, heavy with the echo of Kwame's song, its power lingering like a prayer unanswered. Silas's gaze turned to Kwame, his voice a low growl, heavy with suspicion. The night deepened, the delta alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of the river. Kwame was led back to the cellar, his chains clinking, his silence restored, but his eyes held a fire that no lash could quench. The river of resolve, Mississippi Delta, in the restless dawn of 1832, was a land where the river's soft cadence whispered of freedom and sorrow, its cotton fields a silent testament to the chains that bound Blackthorn Manor's people. The plantation stood as a citadel of cruelty, its whitewashed walls gleaming with a false promise of order, its slave cabins sagging under the weight of despair. The manor was quiet, Silas and Clara in their chambers, their wealth a shield against the sorrow that clung to the walls. Esther's hands trembled as she bound his wounds, her heart a forge where courage was shaped. Esther found Lila in her cradle, her small face peaceful, her breaths a testament to Kwame's sacrifice. But the manor was a powder keg, Silas's wrath a match ready to strike. In peril, its cotton fields a silent shroud under a sky thick with stars and the weight of rebellion. Kwame sat against the stone, his wrists bound by iron, his back a canvas of blood and scars. His eyes lifted to meet Esther's as she slipped through the door, her heart pounding, Lila's soft breaths a quiet rhythm against her chest. He roared, and the baying of hounds followed, a chorus of doom that cut through the swamp's stillness. Esther's heart lurched, but Kwame's voice rose, a low hum, a Yoruba, prayer that seemed to steady the air, to guide their steps through the mire. Lila stirred in Esther's arms, her small eyes bright, as if the song reached her even now. Jonah hissed for silence, but Kwame's hum continued, a quiet rebellion that lit their path. The swamp was a maze, its waters hiding snakes and shadows. But Jonah's knowledge was true, his steps leading them deeper, toward a settlement where whispers of freedom lived. The hounds grew closer, their howls a blade at their backs, and Esther's breath caught as she stumbled, Kwame's hand catching her, his strength a shield against the darkness. "Keep going," he whispered, his voice a river, and Esther nodded, her heart a forge where fear was hammered into resolve. "We're leaving," Esther whispered, her voice trembling but resolute as she knelt beside him, working at his chains with the knife. "Jonah knows a path through the swamp. We can make it to the settlement upriver." Kwame's gaze held hers, deep with pain, but alight with a strength that defied his chains. "They'll hunt us," he said, his voice a low rumble, thick with his Yoruba accent. "The song's a beacon now. It'll draw them." Esther's hand shook, but her resolve was a river, unyielding. "Then we'll move faster," she said. "Your song saved Lila. I won't let them take you." The chains fell away, the iron clinking softly, and Kwame stood, his broad frame unsteady, but his eyes fierce with a fire that matched her own. Jonah appeared at the door, his face pale with urgency, a small bundle of supplies in his hands. "The swamp's our only chance," he whispered. "Silas is rousing the overseers. We've got minutes." Blackthorn Manor stood as a fortress of cruelty, its whitewashed walls a facade of order, its slave cabins trembling under the burden of fear. Esther clutched Lila close, her heart a drumbeat of fear and hope, Kwame's presence a steady anchor beside her. The swamp loomed ahead, its tangled cypress and murky waters a labyrinth of danger and salvation. Jonah led the way, his steps sure despite the weight of his years, his voice a hushed guide through the reeds. "Keep low," he murmured. "The dogs'll catch our scent soon." The air was thick with the scent of mud and decay, the stars above blinking through the canopy, their light a faint promise. Esther's thoughts raced to Kwame's song, its melody a thread that had woven their fates together. A prayer that had saved her daughter, but bound them to this desperate flight. Kwame's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that spoke of trust, and she felt a surge of courage, knowing their bond was a flame that no chain could break. Esther moved through the darkness, her heart a forge where courage was hammered from fear, her arms clutching a small bundle bread, a blanket, a knife, and Lila, her daughter, cradled against her chest. The child's steady breaths were a testament to the miracle of Kwame's song, a Yoruba prayer that had pulled her back from the fever's grip. But the cost was etched in the blood on Kwame's back. The lash marks from Silas Beaumont's whip a stark reminder of the price of his defiance. The preacher Ezekiel's accusations of witchcraft and Silas's plan to sell Kwame downriver were a storm that threatened to engulf them all. Esther's resolve was a flame, kindled by Kwame's sacrifice in Lila's life. And she knew that tonight was their only chance, a desperate bid for freedom through the swamp, guided by Jonah's whispered path. The manor was a powder keg, and Esther stood at its heart, her soul tethered to a mute slave whose voice had sparked a miracle, and a child whose life was a light she would not let die. Esther overheard Ezekiel and Silas in the hall, their voices low and urgent, speaking of selling Kwame to a plantation downriver where his song would be silenced forever. Her heart raced, her thoughts a tangle of fear and defiance. Kwame's voice was a miracle, a gift that had saved her daughter, but it was also a chain that bound them to danger. She slipped back to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gathered a small bundle bread. A blanket and knife hand hid it under her shawl. The stars above Blackthorn Manor blinked, their light a faint promise, and Esther braced herself, knowing that the path to freedom would demand a courage forged in the fire of Kwame's sacrifice. She returned to the cellar under the cover of night, her heart a river flowing with resolve, her soul tethered to the mute slave. Song had sparked a miracle in a child whose life was a light she would not let die. The Delta was a shadow, but Esther's plan was a flame, a rebellion that could free them or chain them to a darker fate. "There's a way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Jonah knows a path through the swamp to a settlement upriver. We can go together with Lila. You'll be free." Kwame's eyes darkened, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. "Freedom's a dream," he said, "and dreams draw blood in this land." Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the cellar door. Jonah, his face pale with urgency. "Silas is coming," he hissed. Ezekiel stirred him up, saying the song's a sign of rebellion. They're planning to sell Kwame Esther. You've got to move now. Esther's heart lurched, and she stood, her hand shaking as she pressed the cloth into Kwame's hand. I'll come back tonight, she whispered, a vow she meant to keep, and fled the cellar, her feet pounding the stairs as she raced to Lila. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. Kwame sat against the stone, his wrists bound by iron, his back a canvas of blood and scars. His eyes lifted to meet hers, deep with pain but alight with a strength that seemed to defy his chains. Lila's stronger, Esther whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him, gently pressing the cloth to his wounds. But Silas will never let you sing again. We have to get you out, Kwame. You can't stay here. Kwame's gaze held hers, and he spoke, his voice a low rumble, thick with his Yoruba accent. The song is my gift, Esther, he said, but it's also my chain. If I leave, they'll hunt me, and Lila will pay the price. His words were a spark, igniting her fear and resolve, and she felt the weight of his sacrifice, a debt that bound their fates. Esther sat by Lila's cradle in the kitchen, her heart a forge where hope and fear were hammered into resolve. Her daughter's recovery was a miracle, her small breath steady, her eyes bright with a life reclaimed from the fever's grip. Kwame sung a Yoruba prayer, rich and haunting, had woven a thread of salvation, its melody a spark that had lit a fire in the darkness of the manor. But the cost was etched in the blood on Kwame's back, the lash marks from Silas Beaumont's whip a testament to the price of his defiance. The preacher Ezekiel's wavering doubt had stayed Silas's hand, but his threat and no more singing was a chain that bound them both. And Esther felt the weight of a storm still gathering, its shadow cast by the power in Kwame's voice. Kwame remained in the cellar, his silence a heavy cloak, his broad frame slumped against the damp stone, his scars a map of sacrifice and resilience. Esther had seen him at first light, led to the fields under the overseer's lash, his steps heavy, but his eyes unyielding, a quiet strength that defied the chains. The other slaves whispered of him, their voices a mix of awe and fear. Silas won't let it rest, Jonah murmured, as he passed Esther with a load of cotton, his eyes darting toward the manor. That song's got power, but it's a curse now. Ezekiel's watching and Clara's whispering of trouble. Esther's heart quickened, the warning a blade that cut through her hope. Lila's recovery was a gift, but Kwame's voice was a flame that drew danger, and Silas's suspicion was a storm that would not wait. Clara Beaumont's scrutiny was relentless, her cold eyes narrowing as she watched Esther's every move. Your child's well, she said, her voice sharp as she inspected the kitchen. But don't think it frees you. Keep your eyes off that mute, or you'll both suffer. Esther nodded, her head bowed, but her heart burned with a defiance she could not voice. A resolve to protect Lila and free Kwame from the chains that bound him. As dusk fell, painting the delta in shades of amber and shadow, Esther slipped to the cellar, her heart pounding as she carried a scrap of cloth and a desperate plan. The cellar seemed to tighten around them, the air charged with the echo of his song, a prayer that had saved her child but kindled a fire of suspicion. The night was heavy, the delta alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of the river, the song of freedom. The Mississippi Delta, in the restless night of 1832, was a land where the river's soft cadence whispered of hope. The cellar was a tomb, its air damp and heavy, the walls slick with mold. The delta was alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of the river. A guide through the darkness as they slipped from the cellar, moving like shadows through the slave cabins. The night was shattered by a shout Silas's voice, raw with fury, echoing from the manor. The mute's gone. Dawn broke, painting the swamp in shades of gold and mist, and the settlement came into view, a cluster of huts hidden among the cypress, a haven for those who had escaped the chains. Jonah's eyes gleamed with relief, but the hounds were relentless, their howls a promise of pursuit. Kwame stopped, his face grim, his voice steady. I'll draw them off, he said, his eyes meeting Esther's. Take Lila. Live. Esther's heart tore, her voice breaking. No, Kwame, we go together. But he shook his head, his hand brushing Lila's cheek, a faint smile curving his lips. My song was for her, he said, and for you. Let it live. He turned, his hum rising into a song, a Yoruba prayer that echoed through the swamp, drawing the hounds away. Esther sobbed, clutching Lila as Jonah pulled her toward the settlement, his voice urgent. "He's giving us time," he said. "Don't waste it." They reached the huts, where hands reached out, pulling them to safety, but Esther's heart was with Kwame, his song a fading light in the distance. The hounds fell silent, and Esther prayed, her voice a quiet rebellion, that Kwame had found his own path to freedom. Years later, the Delta whispered of a mute slave whose song had sparked a miracle, a mother and child who had escaped to a new life. Esther and Lila thrived in the settlement, their bond a testament to Kwame's sacrifice, his voice a legacy that lived in Lila's laughter and Esther's courage. The plantation was a fading shadow, its power crumbling as whispers of abolition grew. Esther never forgot Kwame, his song a flame that burned in her heart, a prayer that had saved her daughter and set her free. The Mississippi River flowed on, its waters carrying the echoes of his melody, a testament to a man who had been chained but never broken, whose voice had woven a miracle in a land of thorns.